The sizzle of bacon punctuated the low murmur of the morning news in the kitchen. Calvin Reed stood at the stove, his calloused hands expertly flipping the rashers as he listened to the market report. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built his life from scratch. His modest bungalow on the outskirts of the city wasn't luxurious, but it was his, earned through years of honest labor and careful saving. "Aiden, breakfast's ready," he called out, sliding the crispy bacon onto a plate lined with paper towels. The sound of teenage footsteps dragging across the floor answered him. Aiden, 17 and perpetually plugged into his headphones, slumped into his chair at the kitchen table. His sharp features, inherited from his mother Marina, were set in their usual mask of teenage indifference. Calvin placed a plate in front of him, watching as the boy barely acknowledged the gesture. "Got any projects coming up at school? The workshops are free if you need to build anything," Calvin asked, trying once again to bridge the gap between them. Aiden shrugged, not bothering to remove his headphones. "Nah, I'm good." Marina breezed into the kitchen, phone already in hand, her perfectly manicured nails tapping away at the screen. At 36, she carried herself with the practiced grace of someone who had grown up in comfort, unlike Calvin's working-class background. "Coffee ready?" she asked without looking up from her phone. "Fresh pot," Calvin replied, pouring her a cup and adding the precise amount of cream she preferred. "Want me to drive you to work today? They're doing road work on your usual route." "I'll manage," Marina replied curtly as she took her coffee and began gathering her things. Calvin watched her, noting how she seemed to glide through the kitchen, as if it were beneath her. It hadn't always been like this. When they first met, Marina had been different, or perhaps he had been too blinded by love to see the truth. She had come to him wounded from her first marriage, seeking stability after years of chaos. Calvin had offered her that stability along with his unwavering devotion and a home for her son. "I made you lunch," Calvin said, holding out a paperback. "That little deli you like was having a special on their Italian sub." Marina took the bag with a distracted nod. "Thanks. Don't wait up tonight. I have that client meeting that might run late." Calvin nodded, though something in her tone made his construction foreman instincts prickle. He had learned to trust those instincts over 20 years in the business. They had saved him from countless workplace accidents and warned him of unreliable contractors. Now, they were telling him something was off in his own home. The morning continued its well-worn routine. Calvin cleaned up the breakfast dishes while Marina finished her preparations for work. Aiden remained absorbed in his phone, occasionally picking at his food. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with unspoken tensions. "Aiden," Calvin tried again, "I could teach you some basics about construction this weekend. Might come in handy someday." "Why would I need to know about construction?" Aiden muttered, finally pulling one earbud out. "I'm going to college next year, not working some manual labor job." The word stung, but Calvin kept his expression neutral. He had grown up in a small rural town where manual labor was honest work, not something to be looked down upon. He had left at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a determination to succeed. Now he ran his own crew, earned a solid living, and had never once missed a mortgage payment. "Education's important," Calvin agreed in a steady voice. "But knowing how things work, how to build and fix them, that's valuable no matter what you do in life." Marina glanced at her watch. "We should go, Aiden. I'll drop you at school." Calvin watched as they gathered their things, moving in sync with each other, and leaving him feeling like an outsider in his own kitchen. As they headed for the door, Marina paused. "Calvin, can you transfer some money to the joint account? I need to pick up a few things." "Sure," he replied, making a mental note to check the account later. "How much do you need?" "Oh, just a couple thousand, the usual." Calvin's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The usual had been getting larger lately, but he had always provided whatever Marina asked for. It was a point of pride for him, being able to give his family financial security. As the door closed behind them, Calvin stood in his kitchen, listening to the silence. 20 years of construction work had taught him to read the signs of structural weakness, to spot hairline cracks before they became catastrophic failures. Now those same instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong with the foundation of his marriage. He moved through his morning routine, checking his tools, loading his truck, reviewing the day's work orders. But his mind kept returning to the subtle signs he had been ignoring. Marina's late nights, her increasing demands for money, the way she barely looked at him anymore. At the construction site, Calvin threw himself into his work. He directed his crew with the authority that came from years of experience, checking measurements, inspecting materials, ensuring everything was up to code. His men respected him. They knew he had done every job on the site himself at some point in his career. "Hey boss, scene, got a minute? I'm not sure about this support beam placement," called out one of his younger workers. Calvin welcomed the distraction and walked over to examine the issue. This was what he was good at: solving problems, fixing things, making sure structures were sound. If only personal relationships could be engineered. As the day wore on, Calvin found himself checking his phone more often than usual. Marina hadn't responded to his lunchtime text. Not uncommon lately, but it bothered him more today. He tried to focus on work, on the concrete reality of the construction site, but his instincts wouldn't let him rest. At 3 o'clock, he received a notification from his bank. A large transfer had been made from their joint account, much larger than the couple thousand Marina had mentioned. Calvin stared at the number, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. He called Marina's office. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed," her secretary said. Marina had left early that day. She said she had an appointment. Calvin thanked her and hung up. He stood for a moment, looking out over his construction site. He had built his life the same way he built his projects, carefully, methodically, with attention to every detail. Now he could feel it all starting to crumble. "Take over for the rest of the day," he told his foreman. "I need to handle something personal." The drive home was a blur of thoughts and memories. Calvin recalled the first time he met Marina at a local coffee shop. She had been recently divorced, struggling to make ends meet with a young son. He had been drawn to her strength, her determination to build a better life, and he had wanted to help her achieve that. The empty house that greeted him felt wrong. Calvin moved through the rooms, noting signs he should have seen earlier. Missing photographs, empty drawers, gaps in Marina's closet. In the kitchen, a single sheet of paper lay on the table. The note, written in Marina's precise handwriting, was brief but devastating. "Your weekend dad status expires today. I'm taking the kids to live with my college sweetheart." Below it, in different handwriting, "We just share your surname, not blood. Enjoy your empty house, ATM machine." Calvin read the words 3 times, each time feeling them cut deeper. His hands, which had never trembled on a construction site, shook now. The betrayal wasn't just Marina's, it was Aiden's too. The boy he had tried to raise as his own. His phone rang. Marina's name flashed on the screen. "Where's the password for the savings account?" she demanded without preamble. Calvin's grip tightened on the phone. When he spoke, his voice was controlled yet dangerous. "Why? Don't be difficult, Calvin. You know I need access to those funds. Like you needed access to the joint account." Her voice was quiet now, but carried an edge that would have made his construction crew step back. "How much did you take, Marina? Don't act surprised. Did you really think I was happy playing house with a construction worker? Oliver can give me the life I deserve. Oliver, your college sweetheart." The name triggered a memory. Marina had mentioned him with a wistful tone when talking about her life before Calvin. All the late nights, the business meetings, the expensive purchases, they clicked into place like pieces of a blueprint, revealing a structure's fatal flaw. "The savings account stays locked," Calvin said flatly. "Goodbye, Marina." He ended the call and sat in his kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of his shattered life. The hurt was deep and raw, but something else was rising in its place, A cold, calculating anger that made his previous frustrations seem trivial. Calvin stood and walked to his home office. He opened his safe, checking the documents inside. Property deeds, insurance policies, investment records. Marina had taken much, but not everything. He still had his skills, his reputation, his resources. Most importantly, he had his determination, the same force that had driven him from his poor rural beginnings to success. He pulled out a fresh notebook and began to write, documenting dates, amounts, patterns of behavior. If Marina and her lover wanted to play games with his life, he would show them what happened when you crossed a man who built things for a living. He knew how to lay foundations, but he also knew how to tear them down. The quiet rage that filled him now was different from any anger he had felt before. This wasn't the hot fury of a betrayed husband. It was the cold, precise anger of a man planning demolition. Marina, Oliver, even Aiden, they had all made their choices. Now they would learn that every choice had consequences, and Calvin Reed was going to make sure those consequences were severe. At the construction site, the hum of activity continued as Calvin directed his crew with his usual authority. But now there was a new intensity in his gaze and a harder edge to his commands. Watch that support beam. He called out to a young worker who was rushing his measurements. One mistake there, and the whole structure fails. The worker nodded nervously, double-checking his work. Calvin's reputation for precision had always commanded respect, but now something else in his demeanor demanded absolute compliance. As the day progressed, Calvin threw himself into physical labor, working alongside his crew with a focus that bordered on obsession. The familiar rhythm of construction work helped him maintain his composure even as his mind processed the magnitude of Marina's betrayal. "Hey boss," Sean approached him during their lunch break. "You okay? You seem different today." Calvin wiped the sweat from his forehead, his calloused hands steady. "Just focused on the job. Sometimes life throws you surprises, and you have to adapt." Sean nodded, though his expression showed concern. Calvin had always been a mentor figure to his crew, teaching them not just about construction, but about life. Today, he was teaching them a different lesson: how to maintain control when your world was crumbling. The drive home felt longer than usual. Calvin's truck, usually a comfortable space filled with plans for upcoming projects, now seemed too quiet. He pulled into his driveway, noting how Marina's car was missing from its usual spot. The absence felt almost physical, a void where his family life used to be. Inside, the house was silent. Calvin moved through the rooms, his foreman's eye cataloging the signs of Marina's departure. Empty spaces on shelves where family photos once stood, gaps in the closet where her designer clothes had hung, the bathroom counter stripped of her expensive cosmetics. In the kitchen, he found himself staring at the note again. The words hadn't changed, but their impact had deepened. His phone buzzed. Another call from Marina. "Calvin," her voice held a note of irritation. "Stop being stubborn about the savings account. I need that money." "For what, Marina?" "For Oliver." His voice was controlled, dangerous. "How long have you been planning this?" She snapped. "Don't act like you didn't see this coming. You and your simple life, your construction work, your modest plans. I needed more. More than a home. More than stability. More than a man who treated you and your son like family." "Family." Marina laughed harshly. "You were convenient, Calvin. A steady provider while I figured out what I really wanted. Oliver can give me the life I deserve." Calvin's free hand clenched into a fist, but his voice remained steady. "And what about Aiden? Did you ever think about what this would do to him? Aiden's fine. He understands that we deserve better than this working-class existence you're so proud of." The conversation continued, each word revealing more about Marina's true nature. Calvin listened, letting her talk and gathering information, even as his anger grew colder and more focused. "I want access to the savings account," Marina demanded again. "You owe me that much." "I owe you nothing," Calvin replied in a quiet, deadly tone. "Let me be clear, Marina. You've taken enough. The savings account stays locked. Anything else you want, you can get from your college sweetheart." He ended the call and sat at his kitchen table, his mind working with the same precision he used to plan construction projects. He pulled out his laptop and began checking his accounts. The joint account had been drained, a substantial sum missing. Marina had timed her move well, waiting until after his latest project payment had been deposited. Calvin opened a new spreadsheet and began documenting everything: dates, amounts, patterns. His years in construction had taught him the importance of detailed records, and now he would use that same meticulous approach to understand the full scope of Marina's betrayal. A text message lit up his phone, Aiden's name on the screen. For a moment, hope flickered, but the message quickly extinguished it. "Mom says you're being difficult about the money. Just give her what she wants and leave us alone. You're not my real dad anyway." Calvin stared at the message, feeling something break inside him. He had tried to be a father to Aiden and had loved him as his own. Now those years of care and attention were being thrown back in his face with teenage cruelty. He got up and walked to his garage, where his tools hung in perfect order on the wall. Each one had its place, its purpose. He had built his life with these tools, created something from nothing. Now he would use that same determination, that same precision, to deal with those who had betrayed him. The next several hours were spent making calls and sending emails. He contacted his bank, freezing accounts and documenting the unauthorized withdrawals. He reached out to his lawyer, Vincent King, a man he had helped through a difficult construction dispute years ago. He began gathering information about Oliver by using contacts he had developed over the years in the construction industry. As night fell, Calvin sat in his empty house, planning his next moves. Marina and Oliver thought they had won. They had successfully used him and discarded him. They were about to learn how badly they had miscalculated. In construction, you learn to spot weak points in a structure. Now Calvin would find the weak points in their lives and exploit them. The hurt was still there, a deep ache in his chest, but it was being transformed into something else, a cold, implacable determination to make them pay for their betrayal. They had taken his trust, his love, his money, thinking he would simply accept it. They were about to discover the difference between Calvin Reed, the provider, and Calvin Reed, the destroyer. The construction site hummed with activity as Calvin directed his crew through their tasks. His voice carried the same authority it always had, his instructions clear and precise. But something had changed in him. His workers noticed a new intensity in his gaze and a harder edge to his commands. "Watch that support beam," he called out to a young worker who was rushing his measurements. "One mistake there, and the whole structure fails." The worker nodded nervously, double-checking his work. Calvin's reputation for precision had always commanded respect, but now there was an added demand for absolute compliance. During lunch break, Sean approached him again. "Boss, some of us are getting drinks after work. You should join us." Calvin looked up from his paperwork, his expression unreadable. "Thanks, Sean, but I have matters to handle." The younger man hesitated. "Listen, we all heard about what happened. If you need anything, what I need," Calvin cut him off in a low, controlled voice, "is to focus on work. The Anderson project deadline is coming up." Back at his empty house that evening, Calvin sat at his dining room table with his laptop open. He had spent hours researching, documenting every detail he could find about Oliver. The man's social media presence painted a picture of wealth and success, luxury cars, expensive suits, high-end real estate deals. But Calvin had been in the business long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving. His phone buzzed with a text from Marina. "The lawyers say you're being uncooperative. Stop making this difficult." Calvin ignored the message, focusing instead on his screen. He had found Oliver's business website filled with glossy photos of upscale properties and glowing testimonials, but buried in online forums and local business records were whispers of dissatisfied clients and questionable deals. He opened a new document and began typing, organizing the information. 20 years in construction had taught him the importance of proper documentation. Every complaint, every rumor, every suspicious transaction. He recorded them all, building a comprehensive picture of his wife's lover. The doorbell rang, interrupting his research. Calvin opened it to find his friend Gavin, a detective he had met years ago during a construction site theft investigation. "Thought you might want some company, Calvin," Gavin said, holding up a six-pack. "And maybe some information." Calvin let him in, clearing space at the table. "What did you find?" "Your wife's new boyfriend." Gavin pulled out a folder. "He's got quite a history. Multiple complaints filed against his real estate business, though nothing ever stuck. He knows how to work the system." Calvin listened intently as Gavin detailed Oliver's past dealings, the pattern of charming investors, making big promises, and somehow always coming out ahead while others lost money. It confirmed what his own research had suggested. "There's more," Gavin continued. "Marina's been planning this for a while. Bank records show she's been moving small amounts of money into a separate account for months." Calvin's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Show me." They spent the next hour going through financial records. Marina had been careful, never taking enough at once to raise suspicions, but the total amount was substantial. "You want me to file charges?" Gavin asked. Calvin shook his head. "Not yet. I need to understand the full picture first." After Gavin left, Calvin returned to his research with renewed focus. Marina and Oliver thought they had orchestrated the perfect exit strategy. They had no idea they were dealing with a man who had spent his life learning how to build things up and tear them down. He pulled up his bank statements, studying the pattern of withdrawals. Marina had grown bolder in recent months, taking larger amounts. He remembered her excuses: home improvements, Aiden's college fund, investment opportunities. Each lie carefully constructed to mask her true intentions. His phone lit up with another message, this time from Aiden. "Mom says to stop being petty about the money. It's not like you earned it doing anything important." The word stung, but Calvin didn't respond. Instead, he opened a new document and began typing out everything he remembered about Marina's past: her failed businesses, her spending habits, her social connections. Like a construction project, he would build his response piece by piece. The night deepened as Calvin continued his work. His dining room table became a command center, covered in papers and notes. He was no longer the betrayed husband reacting in anger. He was a man with a plan, gathering the tools he would need. The house's silence no longer bothered him. It had become his ally, allowing him to focus completely on his task. Marina and Oliver had made a critical mistake. They had assumed his strength lay in his ability to provide. They were about to learn that his real power came from his capacity to plan, to build, and, when necessary, to destroy. Later, in his office, the leather chair creaked as Vincent King, his lawyer, leaned back and studied Calvin with sharp eyes. Vincent's desk was covered in neat stacks of papers documenting Marina's financial activities that Calvin had compiled. "Do you understand what you're asking?" Vincent's gruff voice carried a note of concern. "This isn't just about divorce proceedings anymore." Calvin met his friend's gaze. "I'm not looking for a divorce settlement. I want them to learn what happens when you betray someone's trust." Vincent nodded slowly, picking up one of the documents. "Oliver has quite the reputation in real estate. High-end deals, exclusive properties, but there have always been whispers about his methods." "Tell me more," Calvin said, his voice carrying the same authority he used on construction sites. "He's careful, keeps everything looking legitimate on paper, but he's got a gambling problem he keeps hidden from his wealthy clients, and some of his development deals. Let's just say the numbers don't add up." Calvin absorbed the information, his expression unchanging. "What about legal angles?" "There are always loopholes," Vincent replied, pulling out a fresh legal pad. "Ways to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints." "But Vincent," Calvin interjected, "this path you're considering, once you start down it—" "I've already started," Calvin cut him off. The moment Marina and Aiden walked out that door, they chose this path. I'm just going to show them where it leads. Vincent studied him. He had known Calvin for years, had seen him build his construction business through honest work and determination. The man before him was different now, harder, colder. I'll help you, Vincent finally said. But we do this my way. Smart, legal, untraceable. I have time and resources, Calvin replied. You'll need both. First step, we need to document everything. Build a foundation that can't be traced back to you. For the next several hours, they worked through Calvin's evidence. Bank statements showing Marina's systematic draining of accounts, records of her previous failed businesses, and documentation of Oliver's real estate dealings. Your construction contacts could be useful, Vincent mused, especially with Oliver's development projects. There's always a whisper here about cutting corners, a concern there about safety regulations. I know people who inspect buildings, professional people who take their jobs seriously, Calvin replied. Vincent smiled grimly. Perfect. Now, about Marina's social circle. Suddenly, Calvin's phone buzzed with another text from Marina demanding access to the savings account. He silenced it without reading the message. She's getting desperate, he noted. Good. Desperate people make mistakes. Speaking of which, I've got some interesting information about Oliver's gambling habits, Vincent continued. By the time Calvin left Vincent's office, his briefcase was heavy with documents and plans. He drove to his gym to maintain the routine he had established since Marina's departure. The physical exertion helped clear his mind and allowed him to focus on the steps ahead. Between sets, he observed the other patrons, noting how they carried themselves and interacted. He had become more observant since the betrayal, studying people's patterns and behaviors. A message from scene of the construction site soon came through. Boss, there's talk about one of Oliver's development projects. Some concerns about the foundation work. Calvin quickly typed back. Send me the details. At home, he sat at his dining room table, now converted into a command center. Multiple notebooks contained his observations and plans. He had started tracking Marina and Oliver's movements, learning their routines. A notification popped up on his laptop. A social media post of Oliver at a high-stakes poker game. Calvin saved the image, adding it to his growing file. Each piece of information was a weapon, waiting to be deployed at the right moment. He opened his journal, recording the day's developments. The writing helped organize his thoughts and kept him focused on his goal. This wasn't about quick revenge. It was about systematic destruction. Another text from Marina. Calvin, please, we need to talk about the accounts. He started typing a response, then deleted it. Silence was more effective than words. Let her worry. Let her imagine what I might be planning, he thought. Calvin stood and walked to his window, looking out at the quiet street. Somewhere out there, Marina and Oliver thought they were building their new life together. They had no idea that the foundation was already cracking beneath them. His phone rang, a contact from the building inspection department. Mr. Reed, about that development project you inquired about. Calvin smiled a cold smile that never reached his eyes. Tell me everything. The mahogany conference table in a downtown office reflected Oliver's increasingly agitated expression as he faced his investors. Calvin watched discreetly from the lobby of the building's coffee shop. Oliver's voice carried through the lobby as he followed two men in expensive suits toward the elevator. What do you mean, pulling out? The development is sound. Those rumors about safety violations are completely unfounded. The investors exchanged glances. We've seen the inspection reports, Oliver. And there are other concerns. Oliver's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. What concerns? Your personal financial situation. One older investor replied coldly. We can't risk association with someone who has gambling debts. Calvin sipped his coffee, watching Oliver's face pale. The whispers he had carefully planted were bearing fruit. Back at the construction site, Calvin maintained his usual routine, directing his crew with practiced efficiency. His phone regularly buzzed with updates from his network of contacts. Oliver just lost another major client. Read a text from Vincent. His reputation in the real estate circle is taking hits. Calvin typed back, keep monitoring. What about Marina? Her social circle is shrinking. Amazing how quickly people distance themselves when they learn about betrayal and theft. Scene, the foreman, allowed himself a small smile as he pocketed his phone. He had been particularly careful with Marina's downfall, ensuring each revelation about her past came from seemingly unconnected sources. During lunch break, a coworker remarked, "Looking better, boss. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Just focus on what matters." Calvin replied while reviewing project blueprints. That evening, Calvin received an unexpected call from one of Marina's former friends. "Calvin, I think you should know. Marina's not doing well. Oliver's temper, it's becoming an issue." "Really?" Calvin kept his voice neutral, interested but not overly concerned. "They're fighting constantly. About money, about his gambling. She tried to access some of your accounts, and he completely lost it." Calvin thanked her for the information, then made a call to Vincent. Time to move on those credit reports. The next morning, Marina's past financial troubles became public knowledge in her social circle. Unpaid debts, failed businesses, and the money she had taken from Calvin. It all came to light through seemingly natural channels. Calvin's phone rang. Marina's number. He let it go to voicemail, then played the message. "Calvin, please. Things with Oliver. It's not what I thought. We need to talk." He deleted the message without responding. Let her stew in the consequences of her choices, he thought. At the construction site, another update came through his network. Oliver had been seen at an underground gambling den, betting heavily and losing badly. His desperation was showing. "Sir." A young worker approached hesitantly. "There's someone here to see you." Says his name is Oliver. Calvin straightened, his expression hardening. "Tell him I'm not available," he said from his office window. He watched Oliver pace in the parking lot, his designer suit now rumpled, and his confident demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. "Want me to call security, boss?" Scene asked. "No need," Calvin replied. "He'll leave soon enough." Just as I predicted. Eventually, Oliver gave up and drove away in his luxury car, one of the few status symbols he still maintained. That evening, Calvin spent hours updating his files, tracking the steady dismantling of his targets' lives. Marina's social isolation was nearly complete. Oliver's business was hemorrhaging clients. Their carefully constructed world was crumbling piece by piece. His phone lit up with a text from Aiden. Mom and Oliver had another fight. He threw things. She's crying. Calvin read the message twice, but didn't respond. Aiden had made his choice. Let him witness the consequences. Later that night, Calvin received another call from his contact in the building inspection department. That development project of Oliver's is shutting down pending a full investigation. The violations are too serious to ignore. "Thank you for your diligence," Calvin replied professionally. Safety should always come first. He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, satisfaction coursing through him. The noose was tightening, and his targets were beginning to choke. The city planning office buzzed with activity as Calvin walked through, nodding to familiar faces. His reputation in the construction industry opened doors and gave him access to information others might miss. "Did you hear about the Preston development project?" one inspector asked quietly. "Complete disaster. Safety violations everywhere." "Oliver Grant's project." Calvin feigned mild interest. "Shame. He had quite the reputation." The inspector snorted. "Between the violations and the rumors about his gambling, well, let's just say his investors are running scared." Calvin absorbed the information, adding it to his mental catalog of Oliver's downfall. The trap he had set was working perfectly, each piece falling into place. Back at his office, Gavin, his detective friend, visited. "Got something interesting," Gavin said, dropping a file on Calvin's desk. Oliver tried to access some restricted accounts last night, desperate for cash. How desperate? Enough to make mistakes. Big ones. Gavin leaned forward. He's looking at serious charges if this gets out. Calvin nodded slowly. Make sure it does. Through the proper channels, of course. Gavin added, oh, and Marina. She's been making some interesting calls. Tell me, Calvin prompted. She's trying to contact her old social circle. Nobody's taking her calls. Amazing how quickly people turn when they learn someone's true nature. Calvin's phone buzzed again, a text from Marina demanding access to the savings account. He silenced it without reading. Desperate people make mistakes, he murmured. Later that day, Calvin received a call from one of his construction contacts. Remember those structural concerns you mentioned about the Preston development? We found more. Much more. Document everything. Calvin instructed him to do it by the book. The trap was nearly complete. Oliver's world was collapsing, his reputation in tatters, his finances in ruins. Marina's social standing had been systematically destroyed, her past exposed, her future uncertain. Calvin sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. His revenge wasn't just about causing pain. It was about destroying their entire sense of self, stripping away their arrogance and self-righteousness. His phone rang again. This time, Vincent, Calvin, you need to see this. Oliver just tried something desperate, trying to forge some documents to access restricted funds. It's amateur hour. He's panicking. Calvin smiled coldly. Make sure the right people know about it. I've already ensured his license is as good as gone. Every piece was in place now. Calvin had created a web of destruction so subtle, so seemingly natural, that neither Oliver nor Marina could point to any single cause of their downfall. He opened his laptop and checked the latest social media updates. Oliver's last post showed him still trying to maintain his wealthy image, but the comments told a different story. Whispers about his gambling, questions about his business practices, doubts about his integrity. Marina's accounts had gone quiet. Her last post, weeks ago, had been filled with exclamation points and emojis about her new life with Oliver, but now there was only silence. Calvin closed the laptop and stood, walking to his office window. Below, his construction site hummed with activity, honest work being done by honest men. He had built his life on that foundation, while Oliver and Marina had built theirs on lies and betrayal. The trap was set. All that remained was to watch it spring shut. Calvin's revenge was not just about instant retribution. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign that would ruin them slowly and irreversibly. The downfall began when Oliver stared at the notice on his desk, his manicured hands shaking. The City Planning Commission had suspended all work on his development project pending investigation. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Investors demanding answers, creditors calling in loans. Mr. Grant. His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. Your 11 o'clock meeting is canceled, and the bank representatives are here early. Oliver loosened his designer tie, feeling it constrict like a noose. Tell them I'm in a meeting, he mumbled. The sleek office that had once symbolized his success now felt like a prison. Email after email delivered bad news. Clients pulling out, partners distancing themselves, and rumors spreading through the real estate community. His phone buzzed. Marina again. He declined the call, remembering their latest fight. She had discovered his hidden email account, the one containing correspondence with his various mistresses, and her reaction had been explosive. In the apartment he shared with Marina, the atmosphere was toxic. She paced the living room in her designer clothes, which now seemed more like a costume than a sign of success. What do you mean you can't access the accounts? She demanded, her voice rising. You promised me security. Oliver slammed his hand on the marble countertop. Don't talk to me about promises. You're the one who keeps demanding more money because you keep gambling it away. Marina's voice cracked. What happened to all those real estate deals you bragged about? From a room nearby, Aiden listened to their fighting, his expensive headphones failing to block out their voices. The luxury apartment that had once seemed so impressive now felt suffocating. Across town, in his construction office, Calvin reviewed the latest reports about Oliver's downfall. His network of contacts kept him informed of each new development. "Boss, C knocked on my door. There's a business newspaper with a headline announcing an investigation into Oliver Grant's development projects." Calvin read the article with cold satisfaction. His carefully planted doubts about structural integrity had blossomed into a full investigation, and the anonymous tips about safety violations had done their work. His phone lit up with a message from Gavin. Oliver just tried to access his offshore accounts. They're frozen. He's panicking. Back in Oliver's world, panic was indeed setting in. His carefully constructed facade was cracking. At a high-end restaurant where he was meeting potential investors, his credit card was declined. "There must be some mistake," he said smoothly, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. "No mistake, sir. The card company said to confiscate it," the waiter replied. The investors exchanged glances and made their excuses to leave. Oliver sat alone at the table, his empire crumbling around him. Marina wasn't faring any better. At her usual salon, whispers followed her. Her past financial troubles had become public knowledge. "I'm sorry, Marina," her closest friend said over the phone. "But after what I've heard, I just can't be associated with that kind of behavior." The rejection stung, but what hurt more was knowing she had betrayed Calvin, stolen from him. And for what? A life that was rapidly turning into a nightmare. Aiden watched his mother's deterioration with a mix of pity and resentment. The promises of a better life had proven hollow. Instead of luxury and excitement, there was only tension and fear. Calvin's phone buzzed again, with another desperate message from Marina. He read it without expression. "Calvin, please. Things aren't what I thought. We need to talk." He deleted it without responding. His revenge wasn't about quick satisfaction. It was about complete destruction, and it was working perfectly. Oliver's desperation grew by the hour. His gambling habits, once carefully hidden, became reckless. In an underground casino, he bet heavily in an attempt to recoup his losses. "Mr. Grant," the dealer said after his latest loss, "perhaps you should take a break. Just deal the cards." Oliver snarled, though his hand shook as he placed his next bet. News of his losses spread quickly through Calvin's network. Each piece of information was a weapon, precisely aimed and perfectly timed. Marina's attempts to maintain her social status became increasingly desperate. At a charity event she once dominated, she found herself ignored, her presence an embarrassment. "I heard she stole from her husband," one woman whispered loudly enough for Marina to hear, and that wasn't even the worst of it. Calvin received regular updates about their disintegration. Each report confirmed that his plan was working. Oliver's business was in ruins, Marina's social life was destroyed, and their new life together was collapsing under the weight of their own choices. In his office, Calvin reviewed a final report from his private investigator. Oliver's last development project was being shut down completely, and his reputation in real estate was destroyed beyond repair. "What goes around comes around," Calvin muttered, filing the report away. He had no pity for them. They had chosen their path, and now they would walk it to its bitter end. Eleanor moments later. No, that chapter ended with the downfall of Oliver and Marina. Instead, outside Calvin's house one day, Marina stood with expensive clothes now seeming shabby, her once confident posture replaced by desperate uncertainty. The door opened, and Calvin stood there, his expression unreadable. He had known she would come eventually. It was part of his plan. "Calvin," her voice cracked, "please, can we talk?" He stepped aside, letting her enter. The house hadn't changed, but it felt different now, colder, more imposing, or perhaps that was just her guilty conscience. "I made a mistake," she began, wringing her hands. "Oliver, he's not who I thought he was." Calvin sat at his dining room table, his posture relaxed yet radiating power. "And who did you think he was, Marina? He promised me everything. excitement, luxury, a better life. But it was all lies. She wiped away her tears. The gambling, the affairs, the failed deals, like your lies. Calvin's voice was quiet but cut like steel. Your theft. Your manipulation. Marina flinched. I know I hurt you. Hurt me. Calvin leaned forward. You and Aiden didn't just hurt me. You tried to destroy me. Treated me like an ATM machine, remember? His calm demeanor terrified her more than anger ever could. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'll do anything to make it right. Anything. Calvin's laugh was devoid of humor. Like what, Marina? Return the money you stole. Rebuild my trust. Erase Aiden's cruel words. Please, Calvin. I have nowhere else to go. Oliver has lost everything. Yes, he has. Calvin nodded. Strange how quickly a man's fortune can disappear when his true nature is exposed. Marina's eyes widened as realization dawned. You did this. Did what? Calvin's voice remained neutral. I didn't force Oliver to gamble, or make him cheat on you, or cause his business deals to fail. Those were his choices, just like betraying me was your choice. Across town, Oliver paced in his increasingly empty office. His phone rang. Another creditor demanding payment. His hand shook as he ignored the call. A knock at his door made him jump. Mr. Grant, the investigators are here. A team of auditors, led by a stern-faced woman with a briefcase full of documents, entered. Mr. Grant, we have some questions about irregularities in your development projects. Oliver loosened his tie, sweat beading on his forehead. This is ridiculous. My projects are completely legitimate. The investigator opened her briefcase. We have evidence suggesting otherwise. Back at Calvin's house, Marina was breaking down. I'll do anything, Calvin. Please help me fix this. Calvin stood, his presence dominating the room. There's nothing to fix, Marina. You made your choices. Now you live with them. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching us suffer, she accused. Calvin's expression remained unchanged. No, I'm merely observing. There's a difference. You thought you could use me, discard me, and face no consequences. You were wrong. Marina's phone buzzed. A text from Oliver demanding she return to the apartment after their latest fight in which he had thrown things. He's changed, she whispered. He's not the man I remembered. No, Calvin replied. He's exactly who he always was. You just didn't want to see it. He walked to the door and opened it, his dismissal clear. Calvin, please, Marina pleaded one last time. What about Aiden? Aiden said his room is still here if he wants to learn about honest work instead of easy money. As Marina hurried to her car, no longer the confident woman she once was but a broken shell of her former self, Calvin's phone buzzed with a message from his contact at the building department. Final inspection failed. Grant's project is officially shut down. Perfect timing. Marina would arrive home to find Oliver in an even worse state than when she had left him. Calvin returned to his dining room, where his latest project plans lay spread out. His revenge wasn't complete yet, but it was proceeding exactly as planned. One early morning, a knock at Calvin's door revealed Aiden standing there, looking nothing like the arrogant teenager who had left months ago. Can I come in? Aiden's voice was uncertain, his designer clothes now rumpled. Calvin stepped aside without a word. He had anticipated this moment. But seeing Aiden's defeated posture still stirred something in him. I messed up, Aiden said awkwardly in the kitchen where they had once shared breakfast. I was stupid and cruel, and I'm sorry. Calvin leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Sorry for what? Exactly, everything. The note calling you an ATM, following Mom and Oliver. Aiden's words tumbled out. They're fighting. It's constant now. Oliver threw a glass at her yesterday. I couldn't stay there anymore. And now you want what? Calvin's voice remained neutral. A place to crash until things blow over. Aiden looked up, desperation in his eyes. I want to learn from you. About work. About being a man. Calvin studied him carefully. Aiden's designer clothes couldn't hide his lost expression or his need for structure. Work starts at 6 a.m., Calvin finally said. Manual labor. No shortcuts, no complaints. Really? Hope crept into Aiden's voice. You'll let me stay? On my terms. Calvin's tone brooked no argument. You want to learn about real life. It starts with honest work. The next morning found Aiden at the construction site, wearing borrowed work clothes, his soft hands now used to physical labor. Stay with Scene, Calvin instructed. Learn everything he teaches you. Make one mistake with safety protocols, and you're done. Scene nodded, understanding the unstated message. Watch the boy, test him, and see if he's serious. By day's end, Aiden's hands were blistered and his muscles ached, but he hadn't complained once. Not bad for your first day, Scene reported to Calvin. Kid had a lot to learn, but he's trying. Calvin watched from his office as Aiden helped clean up the site. Though his privileged upbringing showed in his awkward handling of tools, there was a determination in his movements that hadn't been there before. At home that evening, Aiden sat at the kitchen table, carefully applying bandages to his hands. Oliver's latest project failed inspection, he said quietly. Mom's talking about leaving him. She's scared. He's not handling things well. Calvin continued preparing dinner with precise movements. Your mother made her choices, Aiden. I know. Aiden stared at his bandaged hands. I never thought it would end up like this. Actions have consequences, Calvin replied as he set a plate in front of him. Something you're learning now. Days turned into weeks. Aiden's hands hardened, and his understanding of construction work grew. Calvin watched his progress with careful attention, neither lavishly praising nor excessively criticizing. Meanwhile, the reports about Oliver and Marina continued to flow in. Oliver's legal troubles mounted as more irregularities in his business dealings came to light, and Marina's attempts to rebuild her social connections failed repeatedly. Calvin's revenge was working even better than he had planned. Oliver was facing potential criminal charges, Marina's reputation was irreparably damaged, and Aiden was learning the value of honest work and facing consequences. One evening, as they reviewed construction plans together, Aiden looked up at Calvin. You orchestrated all of it, didn't you? Oliver's downfall, Mom's social isolation. Calvin met his gaze steadily. Would it matter if I did? No, Aiden replied after a moment. They deserved it. We deserved it. Calvin nodded slightly and returned to the plans. He had rebuilt his life, not as a victim, but as a victor. The coldness inside him remained, a reminder that betrayal carried a price. The construction site stretched out below his office window, a testament to his ability to build and destroy. He had torn down the facades of those who had betrayed him, stripped away their pretenses, and left them to face the consequences of their choices. Marina and Oliver's destruction was complete, their arrogance replaced by desperation, and Aiden was learning that life's most valuable lessons often came through hard work and honest choices. Calvin stood at his window, watching his crew at work. He had proven himself not only as a builder of structures, but also as a destroyer of those who crossed him. The ruthlessness awakened by betrayal had become a part of him, a cold strength ensuring that no one would ever mistake his kindness for weakness again. 10 years later, Calvin Reed stood at the helm of Reed Construction Group's new headquarters, his company's name displayed prominently on the building's facade. At 48, his hair now had traces of gray, but his presence commanded even more respect than before. The past decade had transformed his modest construction business into one of the city's premier development companies. The Anderson project numbers look good, Aiden reported, setting down a thick folder on Calvin's desk. At 27, Aiden had grown into a capable executive, learning the business from the ground up. His hands, once soft from privilege, now bore the same calluses as Calvin's, earned through years of practical experience. Walk me through the safety protocols, Calvin instructed, his standards as exacting as ever. Aiden detailed the procedures with practiced precision. He had earned his position the hard way, starting as a basic laborer and working his way up. The lessons from 10 years ago had shaped him into a different man. Scene wants your input on the new training program, Aiden added. Scene was promoted to safety director 5 years ago. Loyalty and competence are rewarded. Calvin nodded as he reviewed the proposals. His management style hadn't changed. He remained demanding, precise, and unforgiving of mistakes. The ruthlessness awakened by Marina's betrayal had become a cornerstone of his business philosophy. "Sir," his secretary called via intercom, "there's a news article you should see." Calvin pulled up the local business website. The headline read, "Former real estate mogul Oliver Grant released from prison. 5 years for fraud and embezzlement. Got out early for good behavior." Calvin had tracked Oliver's downfall with cold satisfaction. After the collapse of his real estate empire, Oliver had turned to increasingly desperate schemes, eventually crossing legal lines that even his expensive lawyers couldn't defend. "He tried writing to me in prison," Aiden mentioned softly. "I never responded." Calvin's network of contacts, now extensive and deeply embedded in the city's business community, had kept him informed of Oliver's attempts to rebuild his life during incarceration, and each attempt had been quietly thwarted. "And Marina?" Calvin asked, though he already knew the answer. "Still in Riverton," Aiden replied. "She works as a real estate agent for a small firm. She sends birthday cards sometimes. I returned them unopened." Marina's fall from grace was complete. After Oliver's arrest, she had fled the city. Her attempts to rebuild her social standing in other cities had failed. Calvin's influence had grown beyond their hometown. "Vincent called," Aiden continued, changing the subject. "The Mitchell merger is ready to proceed." Vincent, the lawyer who had helped orchestrate Calvin's revenge, was now Reed Construction Group's chief legal counsel. His unorthodox approaches had helped the company navigate complex deals and acquisitions. Calvin's phone buzzed. A text from Gavin, the detective who had become a trusted friend. Grant spotted at Pete's bar. Looking rough. Calvin showed Aiden the message. "He's not my problem," Aiden replied firmly. "Neither of them are." The lesson had been thoroughly learned. Aiden had embraced Calvin's philosophy of hard work and loyalty, distancing himself completely from his mother's materialistic values. Calvin's revenge had evolved into something more permanent than mere destruction. He had built an empire on the ruins of his old life, transforming betrayal into success. The construction site visible from his office window hummed with activity. His crews, now numbering in the hundreds, worked with the same precision he had always demanded. The company's reputation for excellence was legendary, its contracts prestigious. "The Thompson bid needs your review," Aiden said, laying another folder on the desk. "They're worried about the timeline." "They should be more worried about quality," Calvin replied. His standards hadn't softened with success. A notification popped up on his computer, a report from one of his contacts. "Grant has been seen applying for jobs at several small real estate firms. Each application mysteriously falls through." "Did you hear about Mom's latest attempt?" Aiden asked, his tone distant. "She tried connecting with her old social circle on social media." "How did that go?" "About as well as you'd expect. Your influence runs deep," Calvin replied, his voice cold. His company's success had brought power and connections. The same people who had once embraced Marina now shunned her completely. "Mr. Reed," his secretary announced, "your 4 o'clock is here." The City Planning Commission. Calvin and Aiden exchanged knowing looks. The commission that had once investigated Oliver's projects now sought Reed Construction Group's expertise on major developments. "Life has a way of coming full circle," Calvin commented. The afternoon proceeded with meetings and project reviews. Calvin's management style remained hands-on. His attention to detail was undiminished. Success hadn't made him soft. In fact, it had reinforced his ruthless approach to business. Later that evening, Calvin and Aiden reviewed plans for a new development, ironically, on the same site where Oliver's failed project had once stood. "Remember when he promised me a life of luxury?" Aiden said as he studied the blueprints. "Funny how things work out. You earned this life." Calvin replied. That was the difference. Their relationship had evolved over the decade. The initial mentor-student dynamic had grown into a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. Calvin's phone lit up with another message from Gavin. Marina tried opening a real estate office back in town. The lease mysteriously fell through. "Still keeping tabs?" Aiden asked, seeing a slight smile on Calvin's face. "Always," Calvin replied. His network continued to monitor those who had betrayed him, ensuring their attempts at resurrection failed. The sun was setting over the city skyline, glinting off the glass towers that housed Calvin's growing empire. He had transformed from a simple construction foreman into a powerful business leader, his influence extending far beyond building sites. Scene mentioned that Grant tried applying for a site manager position at Callahan Construction. Aiden said, "They called us for a reference. What did we say?" "Nothing." That was enough. Calvin nodded approvingly. The lesson he had taught his betrayers continued. Actions have consequences, and those consequences can last a lifetime. Later that night, while Calvin and Aiden reviewed plans for a new development, a registered letter arrived. Clara, Calvin's secretary, returned with it. Inside was a note from Oliver, written on prison stationery. "Calvin, I know it was you. All of it. I understand now what I lost, what I destroyed. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just acknowledging the truth." Calvin read the letter twice, then fed it into his shredder without comment. The admission changed nothing. His revenge had never been about acknowledgement. It had been about consequences. "Everything okay?" Aiden asked, noticing Calvin's expression. "Perfect," Calvin replied coolly. He had built something stronger than revenge. A dynasty founded on hard work, loyalty, and the understanding that betrayal carries a price. The city lights twinkled beyond his windows. Somewhere out there, Oliver was trying to rebuild a life from prison's ashes, and Marina was showing modest homes to modest clients in Riverton. Their grand dreams had crumbled, while Calvin's empire had risen. His phone buzzed one final time that night, a final update from his network. "Grant has been turned down for another job. Marina has lost another potential client." The wheels Calvin had set in motion a decade ago continued to turn. "Next week's board meeting," Aiden reminded him as they finished dinner. "We're announcing the expansion." Calvin nodded. Reed Construction Group was about to become regional, spreading into neighboring states. His influence would grow. His power would increase. The betrayal that had awakened his ruthless side had led not only to revenge, but to a renaissance. He had rebuilt himself into someone stronger, colder, and more powerful than before. As Aiden and Clara left for the night, Calvin stood at his window, master of the empire he had built from betrayal's ashes. The coldness inside him remained, a reminder and a weapon. He had learned and taught a vital lesson. Cross Calvin Reed, and the consequences will echo through decades. The city stretched before him, full of opportunities and potential conquests. His revenge had transformed into something greater, a legacy of power built on the understanding that every action has consequences, and some debts can never be repaid. Calvin Reed, once a simple construction foreman, now stood as a testament to what betrayal could create. Not just destruction, but a new kind of strength, cold and unforgiving as steel. The future stretched before him, full of possibilities, all built on the foundation of revenge, served not only coldly, but eternally.